The tray hit the floor before Dean even finished the first verse, and the girl in the black uniform dropped to her knees like someone had cut the strings holding her up. Wait, notice the way Dean's hand freezes on the microphone stand, because what he's about to do in the next 90 seconds will follow him for the rest of his career. The band kept playing. That's what bands do. The drummer held the rhythm, the horns swelled into the bridge, and 300 people in the Crescent Room at the Ambassador Hotel sat with champagne flutes halfway to their lips, not sure if they were watching part of the act or something they weren't supposed to see. Dean's eyes found her before the first piece of broken china stopped spinning on the hardwood. She was young, 22, maybe 23, dark hair pinned back the way all the waitresses wore it here, a few loose strands stuck to her wet cheeks. Her shoulders were shaking so hard you could see it from the back row, and the sound coming out of her wasn't crying. It was something deeper, something that had been held in too long and finally cracked open in the worst possible place. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from and what time is it right now? Table 4, that's where she'd gone down. Right in the middle of the room, right under the lights, right where everybody could see. A man in a gray suit was already pushing back his chair to get away from the mess, lifting his polished shoes like the broken plates might bite him. His wife clutched her pearls, actually clutched them, like this was a movie and she'd forgotten she was real. Dean sang the next line. His mouth moved. The words came out, but his eyes never left the girl on the floor. Nobody moved to help her. Notice that. Hold on to it. Because in about 45 seconds, you're going to understand why. The Crescent Room was the kind of place where problems disappeared before anyone had to acknowledge they existed. The maitre d' was already crossing the floor with that practiced half-walk, half-glide they all seemed to learn in these jobs. 2 busboys in white jackets were right behind him, ready to sweep up the mess and guide the girl out through the service entrance, quiet and efficient as undertakers. But Dean wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her hands. Her hands were pressed flat against the floor, shaking, and she was staring down at them like she was trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. And Dean who'd seen 100 shows go sideways, Dean who'd played through power outages and hecklers and one memorable night when a drunk senator tried to climb onto the stage, Dean had never stopped a song in the middle of a verse in his entire career. He stopped now. The band stumbled. The drummer hit one more beat before realizing the music had died. The silence that fell over the Crescent Room was so sudden and so complete that you could hear the ice shifting in 300 glasses. Dean pulled the microphone from the stand. "Take 5, boys," he said, and his voice was easy, almost casual, the way it always was. But his eyes weren't easy at all. He stepped off the stage. Listen, when Dean Martin walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around him. That was just the way it worked. But this was different. This was Dean walking toward the mess instead of away from it. This was Dean doing something nobody in that room expected, least of all the maitre d', who stopped mid-step with a look on his face like he'd just seen someone break the laws of physics. The girl hadn't looked up. She was still on her knees, still shaking, still making that sound that wasn't quite crying. The broken plates around her caught the stage lights. Shards of white porcelain scattered across dark wood like pieces of a star that had fallen too close. Dean crouched down beside her, not kneeled, not bent at the waist. He crouched like someone who wasn't worried about getting his tuxedo dirty, like someone who'd done this before. And then he did something that made at least a dozen people in that room catch their breath. He put one hand on her shoulder. Remember, this was 1962. This was a room full of studio executives and society wives and men who could buy and sell small countries before dessert. This was a girl who made $2 an hour plus tips, and Dean Martin was the biggest star in the building. You didn't cross that line. You didn't even acknowledge that the line existed. You let the staff handle it. You made a joke. You kept the show moving. Dean didn't move. "Hey," he said, quiet, just for her. But in that silence, every person in the room heard it. "Hey, look at me." She didn't. "I know," he said. "I know it feels like the whole world just fell down, but I need you to look at me. Can you do that?" Slowly, like it cost her something, the girl raised her head. Her eyes were red. Her mascara had run in 2 dark lines down her face. She looked at Dean Martin the way you'd look at someone who'd just walked into your nightmare and sat down beside you like she couldn't quite believe he was real. The maitre d' took another step forward. Dean raised one hand without looking at him, and the man stopped like he'd walked into a wall. "What's your name?" Dean asked. Wait, notice the shift in the room. Notice the way people were leaning forward now, not to get away, but to hear. because something was happening that wasn't in anybody's script, and they all knew it. Maria, the girl whispered. Maria Sandoval. Maria. Dean said it like he was tasting the word, giving it weight. That's a beautiful name. My mother knew a Maria once. Best cook in Steubenville. He smiled. Not the stage smile, but something smaller and realer. You want to tell me what happened? She shook her head. More tears. I can't. I'll get fired. I can't. You're not getting fired. Dean said it like it was already decided, like the universe had been informed and had agreed to cooperate. Not tonight. Not for this. He glanced over his shoulder at the maitre d', and whatever was in that look made the man take a step back. Then Dean did something else that nobody expected. He sat down, right there, on the floor, in his $1,500 tuxedo surrounded by broken plates and spilled wine, in front of 300 of the most important people in Los Angeles. Dean Martin sat down on the hardwood floor of the Crescent Room like it was the most natural thing in the world. The gasp that went through the crowd was almost funny. Almost. There, Dean said. Now we're even. Both of us on the floor. Not so bad down here, is it? Maria stared at him. Mr. Martin. Dean. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, white silk, monogrammed, and handed it to her. When someone's sitting on the floor with you, you call them by their first name. House rules. She took the handkerchief. She wiped her face. And then, in a voice so small that the people at table 7 had to strain to hear it, she started to talk. Listen, here's the thing about secrets. They don't care where they come out. They've been building pressure in the dark for so long that when they finally break through, they'll take whatever door is open. And the door that was open for Maria Sandoval that night was a broken tray and a shattered moment of composure and Dean Martin sitting on the floor beside her. Her father. That's where it started. Her father had been sick for 3 months. Lung cancer. He was in a hospital in East Los Angeles, and the bills were piling up faster than she could count them. She'd been working doubles. Breakfast at a diner on Fairfax, dinner service at the Ambassador. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 weeks. But that wasn't why she'd broken. The letter had come that afternoon. She'd opened it in the staff room during her 10-minute break, thinking it was another bill. It wasn't. It was from the hospital. Her father had died that morning, 8:15 a.m. She'd been serving eggs and toast to a table of tourists when he took his last breath. She hadn't even known. She hadn't been there. And she couldn't go home. She couldn't leave. Because if she walked out on her shift at the Ambassador, she'd lose this job. And if she lost this job, she wouldn't be able to pay for the funeral. And if she couldn't pay for the funeral, the logic had held her together for 6 hours. It had carried her through the setup, through the first wave of guests, through the moment when Dean Martin walked onto that stage and the room erupted in applause. Then she'd picked up the tray for table 4, and the weight of everything she'd been carrying had finally gotten too heavy to hold. Dean listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He didn't look away to check how the crowd was reacting. He just listened, his dark eyes steady on her face, his hand still resting on her shoulder. When she finished, the silence in the room had changed. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was something else, something that felt almost like reverence. Dean reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a silver cigarette case, opened it, and looked inside. Then he closed it again without taking one out. Maria, he said. How much? What? The hospital bills. The funeral. How much do you need? She shook her head. Mr. Martin, Dean, I can't. I didn't tell you because I know why you told me. His voice was gentle. You told me because you needed someone to hear it. That's okay. That's human. But now I'm asking you a different question. How much? She hesitated. In the crowd, someone shifted in their seat. The ice in a glass settled. The whole room waited. $4,000, she said finally. Maybe more. I don't even know exactly. I haven't been able to. Dean nodded. He turned to look at the maitre d', who was still standing there, rooted to the spot like a man watching a car accident in slow motion. Frank? Yes, Mr. Martin? You know George Morrison, the manager? Of course, Mr. Martin. Call him. Tell him Dean Martin is going to need a blank check from the hotel account, and tell him if he has any questions he can come down here and ask me himself. Dean paused. Actually, on second thought, don't tell him that. Just get the check. Frank didn't move for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. Something that might have been admiration, or might have been the dawning realization that he was watching a story he'd be telling for the rest of his life. And he turned and walked toward the back of the room. Notice the crowd now. Notice how they've changed. 10 minutes ago, they were an audience. Now they're something else. Witnesses. Dean looked back at Maria. 4,000 won't cover it. I'm writing you a check for 10. That's for the hospital, the funeral, and 3 months of rent, so you don't have to work doubles anymore while you figure out what comes next. I can't. Yes, you can. He stood up, brushed off his trousers, a gesture that was almost funny in its futility given the state of them, and held out his hand to help her up. You know why? Because that's what people do for each other, or at least that's what people should do for each other. He smiled, and this time it was closer to the stage smile, but warmer somehow. Also, you're going to write me a letter when you get back on your feet. Tell me how you're doing. I want to know how this story ends. Maria took his hand. She stood up, and then in front of 300 people, she did something that probably broke every rule in the Ambassador Hotel employee handbook. She hugged him. Dean hugged her back. Not a quick, awkward pat on the shoulder. A real hug. The kind you give someone who needs to know they're not alone. When she pulled back, her face was still wet, but something in it had changed. She looked like someone who had just discovered that the ground under her feet was solid after all. Thank you, she said. I don't know how to... Go home, Maria. Dean stepped back, his hand still on her shoulders. Go home and rest. And tomorrow, when you wake up, remember that this night happened. Remember that someone saw you. That's all any of us really need sometimes. Just to be seen. She nodded. She took a breath, and then she turned and walked toward the service entrance, her shoulders straighter than they'd been all night. The room watched her go. Wait, remember what I said earlier about the choice Dean was about to make? About the thing it would cost him? Notice the way the maitre d' is looking at him now. Notice the man in the gray suit at table 4, the one who'd lifted his feet away from the broken plates. Notice his expression. Dean turned back to the stage. He climbed the 3 steps, picked up the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. Well, he said, that wasn't in the program. A nervous laugh rippled through the room, but Dean didn't smile. You know what I've learned in this business? He paused and the silence stretched. I've learned that the show must go on. That's what they teach you. That's what they tell you. The show must go on no matter what. You keep singing, you keep smiling. You don't let them see you sweat. He shook his head slowly. But you know what? Sometimes the show can wait. Sometimes there's something more important than the show. And if you can't recognize that when it's right in front of you, if you can't stop and be a human being for 5 minutes, then what's the point of any of this? He gestured at the room. The chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the tuxedos and evening gowns, the whole glittering machinery of wealth and glamour. All of this. It's beautiful. It's fun. I love it. But it doesn't mean anything if we forget how to see each other. And I mean really see each other. Not the masks we wear, not the roles we play. The person underneath. He signaled to the band. The drummer counted off. The music started again. But Dean didn't sing right away. He looked out at the crowd one more time, and his eyes found table 4. Found the man in the gray suit, who was staring down at his empty glass like he wished he could disappear into it. That girl's father died this morning, Dean said, and his voice was quiet now, almost conversational, but every word carried to the back of the room. She found out 6 hours ago, and she came to work anyway because she couldn't afford not to. Think about that for a second, really think about it. He let the silence hang. Now, he said, and the stage smile finally came back. Who wants to hear some music? The applause that followed was different from the applause that had greeted him at the start of the night. It was louder, but it was also more complicated. There was relief in it, and admiration, and something that might have been shame. Dean sang. He sang That's Amore and Volare and Return to Me. He sang Everybody Loves Somebody and dedicated it to all the Marias out there who are carrying more than anybody knows. He sang for an hour and 15 minutes, and when he finally said goodnight, the standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. But here's the part of the story that most people don't know. Here's the part that Maria Sandoval herself didn't find out until weeks later. Notice the man at table 4, the one in the gray suit. His name was Edward Hartley, and he was the vice president of production at one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. He'd come to the Crescent Room that night to celebrate a deal worth $15 million. He'd been annoyed when the waitress interrupted his evening. He'd been ready to complain to the manager, and then he'd watched Dean Martin sit down on the floor. After the show, Edward Hartley waited in the lobby. He waited until Dean came out of the backstage area, still in his tuxedo, still looking like a man who'd just done something he wasn't sure he'd be forgiven for. Mr. Martin? Dean turned. His face was carefully neutral. Mr. Hartley, that was quite a performance. Which part? Hartley didn't answer right away. He looked at Dean for a long moment and something in his expression shifted. Both parts, he said finally. I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen every trick, every angle, every way a man can use a moment to make himself look good. That wasn't any of those things. Dean shrugged. It wasn't supposed to be. I know. Hartley reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I want you to call me next week. I have a project. Something different. Something that needs exactly what you showed in there tonight. I wasn't going to offer it to you because I didn't think you'd be interested. Now, I'm not so sure. Dean looked at the card. Then he looked back at Hartley. What kind of project? A film about a man who gives up everything to do the right thing. I've been trying to cast the lead for 6 months. Every actor I've talked to wants to play the hero. But that's not what the story needs. It needs someone who understands that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't make you a hero. Sometimes it just makes you a human being. Dean took the card. He turned it over in his fingers, thinking. I'll call you, he said finally, but I'm not making any promises. That's all I'm asking. Hartley walked away. Dean stood in the lobby for a long moment, looking at the card. Then he slipped it into his pocket and headed for the exit. But wait, remember Maria? Remember the letter Dean asked her to write? She wrote it. She wrote it 6 months later from a small apartment in San Diego where she'd moved to be closer to her mother. She told him about the funeral, about the relief of being able to bury her father properly. She told him about the 3 months she'd spent getting back on her feet, about the new job she'd found at a hotel that treated its employees like human beings. And she told him something else. She'd been in the crowd that night at the Crescent Room, not working. She'd come back as a guest 6 months later to watch Dean perform again. She'd bought a ticket with her own money, sat at a table near the back, and watched him sing for 2 hours. At the end of the show, she'd stood up and applauded with everyone else. But she hadn't tried to go backstage. She hadn't tried to talk to him. You already gave me everything I needed, she wrote. You saw me when I was invisible. You stopped the world for 5 minutes so I could breathe. That's more than most people get in a lifetime. She signed the letter, Maria Sandoval still on her feet. Dean kept that letter. Listen, he kept a lot of letters, fan mail, business correspondence, notes from friends and colleagues. But Maria's letter went into a different drawer, a locked drawer in a desk that only he had the key to. And once a year, on the anniversary of that night in the Crescent Room, he took it out and read it again. Not because he needed to remember what he'd done. He remembered that just fine. He read it because he needed to remember why. Because in a business built on illusions and a life spent making people believe in things that weren't quite real, that letter was something true, something solid, something that couldn't be edited or rewritten or spun into a better story. A girl had been drowning. He'd reached out his hand. She'd taken it. That was all. That was enough. The film, by the way, the one Hartley had mentioned in the lobby, Dean did end up making it. It wasn't his biggest hit. It didn't win any awards. Most people who saw it have probably forgotten about it by now. But there's one scene about halfway through where the main character sits down on a dirty floor next to a stranger who's crying. He doesn't say anything. He just sits there. The director told Dean to improvise. Dean knew exactly what to do. If you want to hear what happened the next time Dean walked into the Crescent Room and why the maitre d' quit his job 3 days later, tell me in the comments.